Everyone, welcome. I'm Alex and I lead marketing at Citation Canada. We've got a lot of people already on the line today, and with the popularity of this topic, we may reach our capacity. So, apologies to any of your colleagues if they're unable to join us live today. As I mentioned, a lot to cover, so let's jump right into the session. Just a little bit about us, if this is your first time joining one of our sessions. We're a Canadian headquartered software and services company specializing in HR and health and safety management and compliance. We've been helping thousands of businesses across Canada navigate the complexities of compliance and build great workplaces for over 15 years. Today, we've got one of our HR experts with us to answer your questions about the upcoming deadlines for both WHMIS, which applies nationwide, and Working for Workers Acts in Ontario. As we often say, even if you're not in Ontario, many of these legislative changes may be coming to your province, so it's always great to get familiar with them early. Just a few quick housekeeping items before we get into it. We will be recording today's session and we will share that out to all of you in the next day or so that you can revisit it or share it with your colleagues. Please feel free to ask questions via the Q&A functionality in Zoom. We're not monitoring the chat for questions, but you can feel free to engage with one another there. We've already received a number of questions through the registration form, so that's where we'll start. But please do add any more questions as we go, and we'll aim to get to as many as we can cover in the next 30 to 45 minutes. Kim, why don't you introduce yourself and let us know what we can expect to hear about today?
Thanks, Alex, and hello, everyone. As a lead HR consultant with Citation Canada, a big part of what I do is helping employers make sense of HR and compliance changes, especially when the new legislation creates fresh obligations or gaps in your current processes. My job is to take what's in the legislation and turn it into clear, practical guidance so you know what the law says, but how to put it into practice in your workplaces. Because there's a lot happening lately legislatively, and even though this is an AMA, we're going to focus mainly in three areas. First, we're going to look at the Ontario Working for Workers Act, and we're now up to 7 of them as of last Thursday, but specifically on the requirements that are going to take effect January 1, 2026. Now, these include the new rules for job postings and on the requirement for maintaining washroom cleaning records. And then, while it's not technically part of the Working for Workers Acts, we're going to speak to WHMIS and the amendments and the transition deadline that's as of December 15th this year. So if any of your questions touch on these topics or the policies and practices that they affect, you're in the sweet spot for today's session.
Thanks, Kim. So, like I said, lots to cover. Let's get right into our first question, which is on the topic of new job posting requirements. That is, we already have public job postings up before January 1st, 2026. If we have more than 25 employees, do we have to update them on January 1st?
No, the requirements apply to publicly advertised job postings that are posted on or after that January 1, 2026, which is when the provisions actually come into force. Now, note this requirement is for employers with more than 25 employees. If you renew or repost that same job after January 1, 2026, then you should, of course, treat it as a new posting and comply with those new requirements.
And what documents do you need to keep for these new job posting rules, and for how long?
So employers must retain copies of each publicly available job postings for 3 years after the posting is no longer available. Also, you have to retain copies of any notices that you have provided to applicants who you interviewed. We're going to dig in more into that later, informing them whether the position has been filled. Those have to be kept for 3 years after the notice is provided as well.
And if we use recruiters or job platforms to post our jobs, who is actually responsible for complying with these new job posting rules?
Even if you use an external recruiter like a search firm or an online job posting service, the ESA or the Employment Standards Act treats your organization as the employer, and the client compliance obligation stays with you. Third parties can assist with drafting or posting the advertisement, but they're acting on your behalf. If a posting goes out that doesn't meet those new requirements, the liability doesn't shift downstream to those partners. For that reason, we say you should make sure that you review and approve any posting before it gets published. Your contracts or your arrangements with recruiters, well, they can help clarify the roles and expectations, but they don't change who's responsible under the ESA for meeting these new job posting rules.
Got it. Now let's dig into the compensation range requirements on these job postings. We're based in Ontario, but often advertise jobs located in other provinces. do we still have to post a compensation range?
The new requirement applies to jobs that are advertised where the position is to be performed in Ontario. It also applies to jobs or positions that involve work performed both inside and outside of Ontario, where that work that they're doing outside of Ontario is a continuation of the work. This is similar to how the ESA itself applies. So it may be considered or helpful to think about, would the Ontario employment standards apply to this employee who's filling the job? Now, let's also be aware that other jurisdictions, such as BC, have similar legislation requirements to state compensation ranges on job postings. So it's going to become the rule, not the exception.
Now, you've said a few times publicly advertised postings. Do these new requirements apply to internal job postings?
No, yeah, the new requirements apply only to publicly advertised job postings. That's the phrasing in the legislation. So your internal job postings limited to your existing employees, they're not subject to those requirements. Of course, if you do decide to post the job publicly later, ensure that you update the posting to comply with your legislative requirements.
Now, we may need to offer a higher salary to attract a new hire. How do we avoid issues with current employees seeing the posting?
First, remember that you can post a range, so the current employees won't know the exact offer number. And yes, sometimes the market does force you to hire at a higher rate than you paid before. When employees do notice a higher range, let's keep the focus on the role, not the individual. Pay ranges are notionally designed around the job and the current market conditions, and sometimes the market does move between the hires. If someone asks, it's fair to acknowledge the question, reinforce that your internal pay decisions still follow the same factors: experience, performance, and level of responsibility. Also, let's keep an eye on internal equity. If the posted range is noticeably higher than what your strong existing employees in similar roles are earning, maybe we take that as a prompt to review those salaries over time.
And if we use salary grids or bands, do we have to publish those?
You're not legally required to post or disclose your full salary grids or your compensation bands. You only need to include, and the wording here is important, the expected compensation or the expected range of compensation for the position you're hiring for, with that range being no wider than $50,000. If your internal band goes much higher because it reflects, say, long tenured employees, and you don't need to post the whole thing. You could post the part that reflects what you actually expect to offer to this successful candidate. For example, that could be the lower half of the band based on their experience, competencies, and your internal. Also, states may assume, human nature, they'll land at the top of whatever range you post. You can add a qualifying statement, something like, the salary offered will reflect the successful candidate's experience, education, demonstrated competencies, and level of responsibility assigned with the role.
And if we don't have salary bands, how do you pick a range?
Okay. If you don't have formal salary bands, you can still meet the requirement. Let's start with this job, the job that you're posting, not building a whole structure right away. First, get clear on the role, the duties, the level, and the skills needed. Now we look inward. Given your budget and what you already pay people in the similar roles, what would you reasonably pay a solid performer? That would become your anchor. Now we look outward to see if that holds up. Check a few reputable job ads in your region and your sector, look at the wage data, and look at what you had to offer in the past. That outside information is there to validate or nudge your internal sense. And ultimately, the quality and the quantity of the applicants you get is going to tell you a lot about whether you're paying at, below, or above market. So let's build a range around that realistic target, staying within the 50,000 limit, and then do a quick internal equity check to make sure the number fits with your current team. If not, you may have to adjust. Now, if you want help moving from this ad by ad decision to a more consistent approach, well, that's where our resources, such as our employee compensation best practice guide, and for sure, our consulting support. I got to give a shout out to my colleague and compensation guru, Michael Sale. He's here to help.
Yeah, great shot. Compensation can sure be complicated, so a little help goes a long way. On that front, next question. Do commissions count toward compensation to be posted for the range or the $200,000 exception?
Commissions are part of how you pay the role, then yes, they do count towards compensation and both the range and the exception. The regulation of the Act talks about compensation and then points us back to the Employment Standards Act's definition of wages. Now, it's a broad definition, but essentially any monetary remuneration you're paying under the employment contract. Commissions generally do fall under this, so we don't get to ignore them just because they're a variable. Where it gets tricky, though, is a higher commission earning sales role. In those cases, let's look at historical earnings for the role or similar ones and set a good faith range. If you're unsure whether the role might cross over that 200,000 top end or exemption, it's safer to disclose it and then include a qualifying statement, something like total compensation for this role is expected to be in the range of, let's call it 150 to 200,000 annually, and may exceed this range based on individual and company performance.
And similarly, do bonuses or tips count toward the range or the thresholds?
Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. And as I'm known to say often, it depends. It depends on the type of the bonus. Under ESA, wages do not include bonuses that are truly discretionary. For example, a year-end bonus that an employer may decide on, and like after the fact, to pay out. It isn't promised in a contract and it isn't tied to clear targets like hours, sales, or productivity. Also, wages do not include tips or gratuities paid by the customers. So these amounts do not get counted when you're setting that compensation range for the posting or when you're looking if the job falls under that $200,000 exception. However, non-discretionary bonuses are considered wages. So those are bonuses that are written into an employment contract or a plan, bonus or commission plan, and they're tied to specific measurable things, sales targets, performance goals, hours worked, productivity. Those must be included in your compensation calculations.
Got it. And Kimmy, I saw you had that question in the chat, so hopefully that answered that for you. Before we move on to the next topic, there is one question in the version of the 2018 Pay Transparency Act indicates we cannot ask candidates about their current pay. My understanding is that in the January 1, 2026 version, there is no such provision in Ontario. Can you confirm if that is the case?
So all of these Working for Workers Acts and the effect that they've had on varying other pieces of legislations are cumulative. So the January 2026 job posting rules that were affected by, and I'm going to get this wrong, the Working for Workers Act 5 still do not overwrite or negate any of the previous ones. So correct, you still may not ask or require candidates to tell you what their expected compensation is.
Got it. And one other pay-specific question before we move on to some other requirements. If a role has a fixed rate of pay, for example, $35 per hour, do we still need to post a pay range, or is it acceptable to list a single set rate?
Single set rate. So it's the idea of the expected rate or expected range of rate.
Okay, so
Absolutely.
either work. Great.
Sure.
And sorry, one other one. How should profit sharing arrangements be reflected in job postings under these new requirements?
Guess what? I'm going to say that is a great question. And we're going to go away and think about that because profit sharing isn't tied to, we're going to have to look into that. We will get you an answer.
Okay, we'll follow up on that one. And moving on to sort of the next job posting requirement, and that's on AI use. So disclosing whether you're using that in your recruiting process. So what do we need to say in the job posting about AI?
The job posting rules and the currently available regulation, AI is defined very broadly, essentially as any machine-based system that takes in information and uses it to generate outputs like predictions, recommendations, decisions, or content that can affect people or systems. In other words, if a tool is looking at candidate information and helping you to decide who moves forward, there's a good chance that be considered AI for these purposes. So far, the Ontario government has not provided clear direction on what information should or must be included in a statement regarding AI. Pending further guidance from the government or challenges or interpretation as it may be, we suggest employers use the statement to explain how AI is being used in your recruitment process and at what stages. So, for example, is it at screening, assessment, or selection? For our clients, our relevant documents include a new job posting form, Ontario. And in that, we've got proposed language disclosing the use of AI, and then we'll revise that wording if more information becomes available.
So that's something we need to add to postings. Now let's talk about something that we can't include, and that's a requirement for Canadian experience. So if we can't require Canadian experience in the posting, can we ask about it in interviews?
Under the Ontario's new rules, employers cannot require Canadian experience in a posting or as a condition of being considered. Now, this is consistent with longstanding Ontario human rights guidance that treats Canadian experience when used as a screening tool, well, that creates a barrier for internationally trained candidates. In practical terms, that means you should not use Canadian experience, the words itself, as a criteria in your hiring decisions, whether it's in the posting or in the interview. Instead, let's focus on what you can actually ask for and need for the role. Ask about relevant experience, responsibilities, work environments, and results, regardless of where the experience was gained. Now, you still can and should confirm that a candidate is legally entitled to work in Canada. That's a separate and a legitimate requirement.
Perfect. Now, before we move on to the next topic here, there were some clarifying questions back around pay transparency. So if we could just revisit that, Kim, real quick.
Yep.
So it was just to clarify, can we ask what their expectations of salary within the range we have posted are?
That's fair.
That is
I
fair.
mean, that's a conversation, right? A back and forth
Yeah.
conversation. Yeah.
And Rona just wanted to confirm, because she didn't quite hear, you said that we cannot ask a candidate for their current salary. But yes, we can ask for their expectations.
For their expectations. Yeah.
Okay. And now just one before we move on to duty to notify, there's just one question here around whether posting on Indeed would be considered using AI.
To be honest, because I haven't used Indeed from a recruiter's log on, I can't personally, visualize what it looks like. If it does anything that helps you to sort or screen or, and it could be based on settings that you set, then I'm betting that it could be considered AI
No,
because it's the machine doing it, right?
sure. Okay. And now one more. What if your role requires a specific Canadian designation? So this is about Canadian experience. If is it okay to ask for that, or does that become too close of a question to Canadian experience?
Yeah.
If you have to have some kind of designation or certification.
Well, okay, so that's interesting, and this came out of previous working for workers too. You can ask if a designation or certification is a bona fide occupational requirement, like thou must have it in order to fulfill the role. It could be mandatory based on who knows, occupational health and safety or some other. Then yes, you can ask if they have that. The interesting thing is one of the previous ones, don't ask me which one, the government is making it easier and requiring associations and the certifications to be extended and to be more easily transferred into a Canadian certification program. So
Great.
yes, you can still ask.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Now let's move on to the duty to notify interviewed applicants. Question is, we interview a lot of candidates. What's the easiest way to meet the 45-day requirement?
One thing I'd like to start with is that it only applies to people you actually interview, and the clock starts from the date of the last interview for that posting. So somebody might have two interviews. You count from the 45 days starts from the second one. You don't need to use anything fancy or formal like mailed letters. The law allows you to notify candidates in person, in writing, or using technology. So email or maybe a messaging function and tools are on your platform used is perfectly fine. For most small employers, I'd say the easiest approach is going to be using a standard email or message template for unsuccessful interviewees. After each interview or even after each interview round, put a quick reminder in your calendar for, say, I don't know, 30 days out, close the loop with, Jane, John, and Bob, if not already done so. When you know a candidate isn't moving forward, say right away, send the template right then instead of waiting for the end of your process. That way, if possible, use tools you already have, email, Indeed, your calendar. You're treating people respectfully and you're staying comfortably inside the 45-day window. Now, Alex, because my colleague Noah is a rock star, he has informed me that we're going to address the profit sharing. Profit
Okay.
sharing can be included in job postings as part of the total compensation package, but employers must still disclose a salary or wage range. Profit sharing alone cannot replace the listing as the pay range required under legislation. So it can be included as part of the compensation.
Okay, perfect. Hopefully that answers that question. Um, let's move on. Still on the topic of the duty to notify. We've got if the candidate is in Quebec, do I still need to notify them?
Short answer, yes. The requirement applies to the job posting itself. So if the job posting is for a position that falls under the Ontario employment standards, regardless of where the applicant that applied for it is located. So if you post an Ontario-based role and you interview the candidate, you must notify them. There is no exception just because the candidate themselves is not in Ontario.
Perfect. And I see a question from Janali, if I'm saying that correctly. What counts as an interview? Is a pre-screen the same as an interview?
According to the regulation, an interview is a meeting in person or using technology like phone or video, where you and the candidate have a conversation and you ask questions to assess their suitability for the role. So they've given us a definition of an interview. Once you're actually meeting with them to evaluate fit, and this counts as an interview, even if you call it a pre-screen. The regulation also says that an interview does not include preliminary screenings that happen before you decide who's going to be invited to that kind of interview meeting. And now in practice, that usually means something like reviewing applications using basic screening questions built into the platform or the application itself, or doing quick checks to simply confirm some details before you schedule an actual conversation. A helpful way to look at it, if you're just deciding who to invite for an interview, you're probably still in pre-screening. If you're talking with the person, again, by phone, video, or in person, and asking questions to judge whether they're a good fit for your job, then you should treat that as an interview and that 45-day notification applies. If you're feeling like that line's a bit blurry, that's not unusual with new legislation. These definitions often get clarified over time as they're interpreted and then applied in real situations. From a practical standpoint, it can help just to think about the extra step involved. If you've actually spoken with the person, even briefly, it's usually simpler just to send a quick follow-up using ATS or an email template, whatever you've arrived at. When in doubt, I'd say stay aligned with the 45-day requirement, and you'll also have a candidate's experience be more positive.
Absolutely. Mike, I see you had that same question, so hopefully that helped clarify that a bit for you. One other question, Kim, before we move on. Are there specific requirements for how employers must retain publicly posted job advertisements? And if we use platforms like Indeed, where postings can be archived in their system, is that sufficient for meeting the retention obligations?
What was the first part of the question again?
Like what is required for retention of those job advertisements? Is it specifically outlined how or what to retain?
Just that it has to be maintained for 3 years past the posting. Now, I consider even if it is maintained in Indeed, let's say an inspector came in, you could show them, yes, here they are. But what if you don't renew, right? What if you move to a different platform? So I would say like literally downloading it and keeping it even electronically would be a safer bet rather than having to forget. Also, you need to check with whether it's Indeed or another platform how long they keep your postings,
Yeah.
within the system as well. So I would almost go with, once you filled that role, download it, turn it to a PDF, file it away, and then you've got it and you don't have to think about it again.
Yeah, good advice. Claire, I see your question. We are going to address WHMIS. We're coming up to that. We've got one more quick question on washroom cleaning requirements before we get to WHMIS. One question here, our washrooms are cleaned by a contractor. Are we still responsible for the new record keeping?
Yes. Even if you use a cleaning company, you're still the employer under legislation. This refers back a little bit to if you're using a recruiter. The responsibility for meeting the cleaning and the record keeping still sits with you as the employer. In practice, this means building into how you work with your contractor. Make sure they understand what has to be cleaned, how often, and what needs to be recorded. Maybe give them something like we have our washroom cleaning record form to use for tracking and be clear about where and it needs to be posted on site.
All right, perfect. So now we're going to get into those WHMIS changes. First question there, what are the key changes to WHMIS and what is the deadline for employers to comply?
Okay, I should have taken a drink before this one. The WHMIS rules were updated in December 2022, and employers have had until, well, December 14th is the end, and December 15th is, thou must be new moving forward to fully transition. Rather than me trying to pronounce the technical jargon, here's what's changed in plain terms. There's a new hazard category for products that are chemicals stored under pressure. There's the aerosol section has been reorganized, including a new non-flammable category that doesn't require a hazard symbol. A very specific gas category, pyrophoric gases, were removed as its own class and moved under broader flammable gases. Big thing that seems like a short sentence but makes a lot of impact, updated supplier rules for labels, safety data sheets or SDSs, and classifications. So while the core WHMIS framework is the same, the hazard classes and labels have changed, and we need to be fully aligned with those moving forward December 15th to less than 2 weeks.
Got it. Just a reminder for everyone who's using the chat, if you have questions that you'd like Kim to answer, please put them in the Q&A area. That will make sure that we get to see them there. Okay, next question. What do we need to do to comply with the WHMIS changes?
The practical steps start with identify which products in your workplace fall under the updated hazards. Update your WHMIS binders, access, labels, and inventory as your new SDS and supplier labels arrive. Make sure your workers complete updated WHMIS training that reflects the updated WHMIS requirements. I think that we're going to see this marketed as new WHMIS in the training world. Now, in the legislation, the amended system is now simply going to be referred to as WHMIS. So an eye on, it's WHMIS, but does it have the most up-to-date amendments? And certainly update your site-specific and your job-specific training so that it lines up with the new classifications and the label formats. The big picture is that the compliance isn't about starting from scratch, but it is about updating your product lists, documents, and training so that your program reflects the new hazard classes and label requirements.
And is it mandatory to do the new WHMIS training if new hires just completed the previous version last month?
The short answer is they're still going to need the updated WHMIS training at least once. Even if someone just did the old course, that training was based on the pre-amendment version of WHMIS 2015. Because of the significant changes, workers need to do the full WHMIS course that reflects the amended requirements before December 15th, 2025. That's the deadline. Once the full course is completed, well, then you can use refresher versions moving forward.
Perfect. And what is the sites and job specific WHMIS training and what does it need to include?
WHMIS training obligations in two parts. The course could be e-learning, could be classroom, being the general education, and then the hands-on or the on-the-job piece, which is your site and job specific training. That second part, well, that's where we may fall short, and it's the one that keeps people safest day to day. Site and job specific WHMIS training means you're talking about your actual workplace and your actual products, not just generic examples. It should cover at a minimum the specific hazards that the people are using, handling, storing, or disposing of at your site or work sites. how to use, handle, and dispose of them, sort of step by step. This is how we do it here. Any special procedures for certain locations. For example, what changes if a product is used in a small room or an area with poor ventilation? Key one is the PPE, that is the personal protective equipment. Now that is required for each product based on both the safety data sheet and label. That includes how to put it on, take it off, look after it properly, and certainly what to do in emergency involving those products around spills, splashes, or fires, who to call, where to go, and what the first steps are. So while the online or the classroom WHMIS courses give workers the basic language and concepts, your on-site and job-specific training connects to the real life in your workplace with your chemicals, your equipment, and your procedures.
And if we have all remote employees that are all administrative roles, how will the WHMIS changes affect them?
So WHMIS training requirements apply based on not where, but whether the employee uses, handles, stores, or may be exposed to hazardous products as part of their work, not necessarily whether they're on-site or remote. Even for those fully administrative employees that when they don't work with hazardous products, the impact of these WHMIS changes will typically be minimum. In some cases, they may, it depends, not require WHMIS training unless they could be using or storing hazardous products in their home workspace, or they're required to work or review with safety data sheets. Maybe they're in HR, safety, or a procurement role, or part of their role has occasional on-site responsibilities that does involve hazardous products. If your remote employees fall into any of those, then they will need to complete the updated WHMIS training, along with, again, the site-specific and job-specific components that apply to their roles and duties.
All right. And if they're working from home, do all household products with hazard symbols in their home office count as a WHMIS product?
Necessarily. A lot of products you buy at a grocery store, hardware store, cleaner sprays, they're classified as consumer chemical products and they fall under something called the Consumer Chemicals and Containers Regulations, not WHMIS. So they don't come with safety data sheets and they're not treated the same way as workplace chemicals. That said, if a household product is being used for work purposes, for example, an employer provided a cleaner for equipment or workspace, then it becomes part of your workplace health and safety picture. Now, you don't need a full safety data sheet binder or for every bottle of glass cleaner, but you do need to make sure that employees know that they're using and understanding the basic hazards and label warnings. They know how to use, store, and dispose of, and what to do in case of an emergency. For your remote employees, it's less about turning their whole kitchen into a WHMIS site and more about making sure that any product they use for work are covered under your information, your instruction, and training.
Perfect. And a question in around the refresher courses. So, are employers required to administer WHMIS refresher courses?
Technically not. This is probably one of the hottest debated training questions ever. Technically, it's a one and done unless something in your workplace changes. So if you have a new product that comes in and a new safety data sheet and a new label, then you should do the refresher because they're going to now have to know what that label that they're not used to saying means. Or you move the eye wash station. So there isn't really a how often it's being doing applying your due diligence insofar as providing training as is applicable and as is the circumstances in your workplace change.
Got it. And one person just wanting to confirm the date that employees have to take the updated WHMIS training by.
Midnight, December 14th.
That's right.
Because
So
what
by
happened
December
was,
15th.
for a little bit of context there, we had a 3-year transition period, but you could only stay with the old and then switch to the new whenever you were ready to switch to new. You couldn't do part back and forth, and you couldn't switch to all the new. Yes, 2025 margarita. You couldn't switch to all the new until you had all the new safety data sheets and labels. So that's why it seems like it's all of a sudden here because it was a long transition and there was no, being half and half for a while.
Yes, and I know that there were a couple questions around the training within the citation platform. So for those who are existing customers of ours, yes, the updated training is available to you. The older training will be removed as of the deadline because that will no longer be able to be assignable. There were some communications sent out around that. If you need some more information on that, absolutely reach out to your account manager and our support team, and we can help you find what you need in time for that deadline. Um, I know there were quite a few other questions on WHMIS. Noah, was there anything else that we hadn't already covered? If you could help me filter through that, let me know. But while we wait to see if there's anything else, I think, Kim, why don't I pass it back to you to kind of just pull everything together for us, highlight the main action items, and if another question or so comes in, we'll get back to that.
Well, the big takeaway is that these changes are not just technical updates. They have real implications for your policies, your processes, and clearly your day-to-day operations. With respect to job posting changes, let's look at anything that touches recruitment and hiring practices, including your record keeping and file management, compensation strategy, and pay transparency readiness. Then for the wash and cleaning records, think about whether the cleaning is internal or contracted, where and how records will be posted, and who and storing them. The big one for the WHMIS transition, be prepared to review your safety data sheets and labels that from your suppliers are current, and if there's any updates based on those required in your health and safety procedures, including which training different groups of employees actually need. Now, I saw this question when I say which training different groups, the WHMIS training from the educational standpoint is all the same because that's the overarching, but your hands-on practical training may be different for different groups of employees. So across all the areas, it's about alignment, updating policies, forms, and internal processes as applicable. So while the legislation is telling us the what, your policies and your practices are going to determine how. Making sure they're updated, communicated, and practical is going to make these changes much easier to implement.
For sure. Just two follow-up questions on WHMIS before we wrap up. So one was a follow-up to your mention of the consumer chemicals. Do you have to provide training on those consumer chemicals, or is that covered in the new WHMIS training?
No, it wouldn't be covered in the women's training because most consumer chemicals, there's some overlap, but they don't use the same women's. You don't have safety data sheets for a starting point. The labeling and the symbols may be the same. It's where you have instructed your employee to use a consumer product for cleaning in a workplace.
Got it.
So don't mix bleach and Windex.
Noted. So one big one on WHMIS, what are the consequences for non-compliance with the updated WHMIS training, and who bears those consequences?
Well, this would fall under non-compliance under the Occupational Health and Safety Act as a whole, which that one of a lot of legislation has pretty good teeth. And if I'm not mistaken, they're even working at upping the administrative penalties. So who pays? Well, the employer pays, the organization as a whole. But let's also keep in mind that if supervisors or officers of a company are found to be not compliant or at fault, they literally can be charged under the Criminal Code of Canada. So let's just be
So make
compliant.
sure we comply. Absolutely. So thanks for joining. We did go a little bit over our original half hour. Thanks for sticking with us. If we didn't get to your exact question and you are a client of ours and you have live HR advice, this would be a great time to leverage that and reach out with those questions. If you're not yet a client, become one so that you can ask these questions. And with that, we'll wrap up today's session. We do thank you for joining us. We'll hope you'll come back to our next webinar in January. While I have you, I will note for those clients on the line, our offices will be closed between December 24th and January 1st, reopening on January 2nd. So if you are a member or if you're planning to become one this month, please do plan accordingly as our teams will be off enjoying the holidays. As it is December, I am officially allowed to wish you all a great holiday season and a very happy new year. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you in January.
Thanks, Alex.